Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, rulers, shields, desolate sirs, peasants, vassals, bankers come. I'm a useful idiot, and today we're going to talk about the fact that the banks earn more in the last quarter than in any other quarter in the last 6 years. So from July to September, the banking industry had the most profitable quarter they've had in 6 years, $37.6 billion. And 82% of that revenue belongs to the four biggest banks. So they dominate the market, and they get the lion's share of that $37 billion. And so first of all, it's kind of interesting how these banks can have these record profits, all things considered. And we'll get into that more in a minute. And also we'll get into the details to find out if this is really that big a deal or not, because like everything in finance and government, there's a lot of fraud, a lot of smoke and mirrors, and a lot of kiss and tell. So they're trying to paint this as a great thing. This is another sign of the recovery and how well the banking industry is doing. And first time since 2009 that the biggest contributions to bank earnings was increased revenue rather than reductions in what banks set aside for loan losses. So for quarter after quarter, for a couple of years now, most bank profits were just reductions in what they set aside for loan losses. And they're also trumpeting the fact that our troubled bank list is now dropped to 700, so 694 to be specific. And only 50 banks failed this last year. But that's still a pretty high number, considering this is theoretically 5 to 6 years after the financial collapse, or 4 years, 5 years. And of course, this list of 700 troubled banks is still 10% of all FDIC covered banks. So not such great news. And here's the real kicker. The real boost in revenue was caused by the sales of loans to other institutions. And that's a nice way of saying that they basically took a lot of their toxic legacy assets, their bad loans, their bad mortgages, and they pawned them off on somebody else. So a lot of this stuff, of course, goes to the FHA, goes to FDIC, goes to Fannie and Freddie, and ultimately probably will get passed on to the taxpayers at some point, like all the other crap. And so that's pretty noteworthy, sales of loans to other institutions. So their profits were boosted by unloading a lot of this toxic crap they've got on their books. And but for me, the real story here is two things. One, how these profits were generated, and the other thing is the mechanisms that have been keeping these banks going for the last 5 years. So first of all, let's look at some of the other things besides the fact that they've been selling off their loans to other institutions. And one, of course, is massive layoffs. The entire banking industry, particularly the large banks, have been laying off hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of employees. They've also not been loaning. And so we either have a restriction on consumer loans, or we have another huge subprime loan market where little money is put down and small payments are required. So we're kind of setting ourselves up for more trouble that way. And then, of course, all the big banks are making all their money in the derivatives market. So that's where a lot of that $37 billion is. All the free money that goes to these banks, they just go back to the roulette table and the gambling out in the derivatives market. And that's where the money is generated. And then, of course, they've been paying fines for money laundering for drug cartels and terrorists, but that's just a minor annoyance. And but this is my real point. This is what I really want to drive at. So here we are 5 years later since the market collapse, the financial collapse, and now these banks are flush with money. They're having huge profits, the best in 6 years. In the previous quarter, in the last quarter of 2012 here, and But what I want to ask is, okay, if they're doing so well, then how come they still are parking their reserves at the Federal Reserve and getting interest on it? So if they're doing so well, they should be able to stop doing that, right? Because it's been five years now, 5 or 6 years. They changed the mark-to-market rules back 5 years ago, and so I suppose they could change the mark-to-market rules back so that banks would actually have to mark down on their balance sheets the deterioration in a lot of their loans that they carry. But no, they haven't done that yet either. And then several of the big banks, investment banks, changed their status to bank holding companies so they could get money directly from the Federal Reserve. And I don't think all the banks have gone back to just being investment banks and not being bank holding companies. So that's kind of curious. And then here it is 5 years later, and all these big banks are still getting free money from the Fed, practically zero interest. 5 years going, just filling up these, recapitalizing these banks at zero interest and letting them take it out and wheel and deal in the derivatives market and generate these profits. And then, of course, these banks have gotten QE1, QE2, QE3. That's been going on for constantly, the Fed twist. All that's been going on in the last 5 years, and they're going to keep that going. So, gee, if they have to have Q and E keep going, then I guess things can't be that great. And then they got to bypass all their legal obligations for all the foreclosure fraud and all the losses they could have taken on the foreclosure fraud scandal. But no, the Barack Obama administration made sure that they swept that under the carpet, and they actually got a pretty sweet deal on that. And then, of course, so many of these banks are paying no taxes. Yes, that's right. Still, 5 years later, and a lot of these banks are still not paying any taxes. Another little handout that they got as a result of the collapse 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So there's the real story. These banks are laying off hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands and generating what are coming to be record profits again, and yet we still can't get them off the government tit. Here it is 5, 6 years later. They're still on the government tit and still being subsidized. So not exactly quite the recovery we thought. But there is a silver lining, and that's the fact that with a smaller employee pool, everybody can still get gigantic fat bonuses. So there's a happy ending here. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.